Question number 4, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he take responsibility for the actions of the David Henry inquiry?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the inquiry reported to the Chief Executive of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Director of the GCSB. I had no involvement in it while it was underway, which is entirely appropriate. However, I did ask for the inquiry to be set up and agreed the terms of reference, so I do take responsibility for the inquiry.
Thank you. Supplementary?
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister then take responsibility for the fact that his inquiry, acting under his mandate, asked for and received Fairfax journalist Andrea Vance's building access records?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think we've made it quite clear that in no way was the inquiry set up on a basis to access the records of a journalist.
Well, point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Dr. Russell Norman.
My question was, does he take responsibility for it? I think it's a pretty straightforward question.
Would the member please repeat the question for the benefit of the Prime Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for the fact that his inquiry, acting under his mandate, asked for and received Fairfax journalist Andrea Vance's building access records?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, and the reason for that is the inquiry at no point asked for a journalist's records, either access records or phone records. No, they didn't. And what's been made quite clear is not only did it not ask for it, because those terms of reference were in the public domain. So every member of this House, every journalist and every member of the public had the right to see and did see, if they chose to, what those terms of reference were. And when inappropriate information was sent to the inquiry, what ultimately happened, of course, was the inquiry itself fully understood its mandate and never accessed that email, that information. In fact, attempted to reject it.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Prime Minister aware that in the answer he just gave, he said that the Henry inquiry did not access Andrea Vance's building access records, and does he wish to correct that answer?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that's not right. What I'm saying is that was not part of the mandate, and when I was made aware of that, I made it quite clear how strongly I felt in opposition to that.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that it was his inquiry, established under his authority, and regardless of what he may view the actions of Mr. Henry, nonetheless it was under his authority, that under that inquiry this journalist had her activities monitored, her movements around the building monitored, will he apologise to Andrea Vance?
Mr. Speaker, I made it quite clear that I find the actions that took place with regard to this totally inappropriate. I made that clear quite some weeks ago, but I also make it quite clear at no point did the terms of reference indicate that a journalist's activities were part of this, and if they were, then the member himself would have said something about it, members of the media would have said something about it. Nobody understood it to include journalists, neither did the inquiry itself, because when inappropriate information was sent to it, it said, and I quote, we did not request the second report you attached here, i.e. the one showing all calls from the numbers of interest. We are not interested in looking at it. And I'm advised that the administrator that got that information never accessed it itself, so it was never accessed by anybody.
Order.
Order. Point of order, Dr. Russell Norman.
Mr. Speaker, the nub of my question, which I don't believe the Minister addressed, was will he apologise for the fact that the Henry inquiry accessed the journalist's building access records? That's the question.
I accept the point the member's raising in that the Prime Minister didn't directly address whether he would apologise, but he gave a very substantial answer as to why he didn't feel that because the building it wasn't a part of the terms of reference that he didn't have to. I think the member's question has been adequately addressed.
Supplementary.
Supplementary order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the email that the Prime Minister has read to us earlier today, which described the request from the Henry inquiry, which was of a form that it was requesting the telephone records that showed the contact between Andrea Vance and Peter Dunn, does he therefore take responsibility for the fact that Henry ended up with Vance's phone logs?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've made it quite clear that there is no way that those phone records should have been sent. Okay, Mr. Speaker? Our office was not aware that they had been sent until we saw the information on Friday. The DPC made aware to us. In relation to the logs of people moving around the buildings, Mr. Speaker, if you go back to looking at the terms of inquiry, it says it will include reviewing communications and copying equipment and records, logbooks and any other material considered relevant of the persons or their officers who are likely to have access to the compliance review report. Now, that was read by Mr. Henry as likely to be Andrea Vance, and so on that basis he did request that. I've made it clear I think that that's wrong. I don't think he should have asked for that information.
Supplementary question, David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he take responsibility for the email that he has just tabled?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I take responsibility for establishing the inquiry. I think it was quite important that we got to the bottom of the information. I take responsibility for ensuring that I think it was clear to the inquiry through setting up the mandate of what was part of the rules and what was not. What I don't take responsibility for is that someone in Parliamentary Services decided to send information to the administrator because the administrator of the inquiry never asked for that information, and when it was received they did not want to receive it. They made it quite clear. The email proves that quite specifically.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Does the Prime Minister accept...
Order! Member can start his question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister accept that a reasonable person receiving the email which he has just tabled and described to us, and accepting his word as an accurate description of that email, that a reasonable person receiving that email requesting basically information on the contact between Vance and Dunn, a reasonable response would be that what the inquiry was after were the phone logs on both sides?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no. What I accept is that this was looking at ministers or their staff that had contacted, or the contact between those numbers. That's not the point. That is not the point at issue. What was released was that log, and that log was completely empty. What was also released, and should not have been released to the inquiry, was all of the contact made by Andrea Vance's phone records, and that was never requested and should not have been requested.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, will the Prime Minister accept any responsibility for what has been a significant snafu in anyone's vocabulary, and that part of the reason this happened was because the terms of reference that he wrote up were interpreted, according to him, by Henry as giving Henry the authority to go after Vance, both in terms of her building access records, he went after Vance, and then a contractor at Parliamentary Services received an email from the Henry inquiry which they misinterpreted, according to the Prime Minister, as asking for both sets of logs. That inquiry was established by the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister not responsible for those actions?
Well, right, Honourable Prime Minister.
See, notwithstanding that was a speech, not a question, let me give this answer, Mr. Speaker. No, and the reason for that is quite clear. I think the terms of reference are clear. They are about the activities of ministers who received the report and their staff. That is quite clear. There is absolutely no question from this email log that it shows not only did we understand that, but actually the people undertaking the inquiry understood that because they rejected that information. And thirdly, Mr Speaker, if it was so ambiguous, if it was so unclear, well, the member rates himself as the so-called unofficial leader of the opposition. Why didn't he pick it up? If it was so unclear, why did not every journalist in the building who saw the terms of reference pick it up? The answer was it was clear to everyone what we were looking at, ministers and their staff, and that would be the expectation of any good inquiry.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, right honourable
Could
Winston.
the Prime Minister share with the country when he had exactly this glorious, though belated epiphany of conscience that suggests that MPs and journalists' phone records have a certain sanctity of privacy, as was not what he did in September 2008 when he and Mr Dunn demanded I give all of my telephone records over to their jacked-up inquiry?
Right honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I don't remember demanding that, but I do remember being interested in getting the answers, and from memory we're still waiting.
Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Prime Minister seriously saying that contact between ministers and Andrea Vance includes the minister's calls, but not Andrea Vance's calls?
Right honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the email says we are interested, this is actually from the inquiry, but the Administrator, we are interested in any contact between the Minister's personal landlines and these numbers. That is all. There is nothing in those areas there. That log, as it quite clearly shows, is empty. The point at question is all the other phone calls that were made.
Question number 5, Melissa Lee.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Housing and asks how many findings and recommendations did the productivity